I'm Steph.
And I'm Jeff. Each week, we review a film that's streaming on Netflix or Amazon Prime.
As writers, we'll deep dive into the hook, plot, characters, and ending to tell you if it's a good story.
Listen at your own risk. This review contains spoilers.
Now sit back,
relax,
and enjoy Stream On. Today we'll be reviewing Midnight Special, streaming on Netflix.
Alton Meyer is a young boy with special powers. He has been taken from a cult, the Ranch, by his father, and they want him back. So do the feds, since he can hear and decrypt NSA radio transmissions.
Midnight Special was directed by Jeff Nichols and also written by Jeff Nichols. It stars Adam Driver as Paul Sevier, a lead operations analyst at the NSA, Michael Shannon as Roy, Alton's dad, Jaden Martell as Alton, an 8-year-old boy with special powers, Kirsten Dunst as Sarah, Alton's mom, and Joel Edgerton as Lucas, a Texas state trooper and friend of Roy's.
So, Steph, you picked this movie. Why?
I like sci-fi films. It's my favorite genre. This one got decent reviews. It was available on Netflix, so I figured let's check it out.
All very good reasons. What movie did this remind you of?
I chose a classic, E.T. So the reason I picked E.T. is that it's also a sci-fi film, and it's about a special being or alien that people are trying to protect from the government. In both films, the government is seen as, quote, the bad guy that's trying to capture the alien / special being. And you also have the kid element where it's centered around a child. E.T. is also centered around children. And both this special kid / alien and E.T. the alien are trying to get back to their home planet or dimension. So I felt there were enough parallels that if you like that E.T., you may like this film. What about you, Jeff?
I went with Firestarter, a film from about the same time as E.T. It has a very similar premise of a young child, in the case of Firestarter, Drew Barrymore, with superpowers who's being hidden by her father while secretive government forces hunt her. The ending of Firestarter is a bit different, and the film does lean a bit more heavily into mid-80s cheese, but the premise is pretty close, and apparently the filmmakers knew that when they went into this. That was one of the things they referenced as like an inspiration for this, as well as a lot of other 80s sci-fi like E.T.
As a theme in 80s sci-fi about the government being bad and trying to like stop the supernatural stuff from going on, right? Whatever that is. I feel like that's a common, like, don't trust the government and the government is the bad guy that we see throughout 80s sci-fi films.
It's kind of a holdover actually from the 70s. So in the wake of like Watergate and the revelations of the Pentagon Papers and some of the other things like the Church Commission on the CIA, you see a lot more movies that are getting into the government as the bad guy with all these, secret plots and hunting down special people or aliens or just the people on the fringe. So, but yeah, that was definitely a thread that ran through a lot of movies from those decades.
Yeah, and this movie, Midnight Special, had that, even though it wasn't set in the 80s, it had that nostalgia feel with that similar theme, which is why I think we both chose films from the 1980s that it reminded us of. So let's jump into the hooks. So what'd you think about it, Jeff? Did you like it? Did it grab you?
I thought the hook was great. We get a really good in media res start where you're dropped into the action. A lot of stuff has already happened. You do not get a lot of heavy exposition dumps about what's going on. You find out little bits of information from the character interaction, and then any of the more exposition stuff is handled through news reports that are going on in the background. You find out enough about the relationships of the different characters that you get a feel for who they are and how they react to different situations. But you also don't have a bunch of stuff just spelled out and blurted out. For example, we get a good sense of the relationship between Roy and Lucas, the two men who are taking care of Alton, but it isn't spelled out why they're helping each other until much later in the movie. But it doesn't matter because enough of it is set up that we accept what they're doing. We understand the relationship without them saying, "You've been my buddy since childhood," is what we eventually find out. And you also brought your kid over and he exposed me to his special powers, which we also find out later. But enough is done so we understand the devotion and also some of the tension that's happening between these characters. Referencing Roy and Lucas, there's an early scene where they're confronted with a police officer and Lucas shoots him. But it's clear that they're not on the same page about how to handle that. But it's handled in a way that seems very natural and engaging and not really overly dramatic or overly exposition heavy. And the movie, the reason why I think the hook really works is that the movie trusts its audience enough to give them enough information so they understand the world and to start setting up that mystery box that you want to pull apart as the movie goes on. And it establishes the characters well enough that you get their motivations without a moment where they're all sitting down laying them out for you. And the hook itself pretty much ends with the people from the ranch, this religious cult that Alton grew up in, that Roy was part of, being arrested by the FBI and questioned. And at that point, we start to get more of a sense that Alton has special abilities. We understand why the government's involved. And I thought that explanation was very well done. Again, it's not over the top, but it's like we detected that some of your sermons have top secret information that we were transmitting between, bases and stuff. How did you know it? And it's like, oh, this kid was telling us. It's like, oh, well, that's an interesting ability. I thought the hook worked. It did exactly what I wanted to do. And it really set up that, again, the mystery that this story is going to unfold for us.
So I agree with you that it does a good job setting up that mystery box. By the end of the hook, I was into the movie and I wanted to see what happens next. I mean, they have the mystery of why does this kid Alton have these special powers? How did he end up in this fundamentalist? The cult was sort of set up to look like LDS fundamentalists. Like, how did he end up in this cult? Another mystery was the date March 6th got thrown out as a key date. Why is March 6th an important date? Where are they going? Like, he has been taken from the cult by Roy and Lucas. Why? And then how is he getting this information on the encrypted satellites? There's so many mysteries it dropped and did it in a way that really intrigued me. The hook ends with a great scene between Paul Sevier with the NSA and the cult leader where they are talking about what's happening and why the government has come to question all these people on the ranch. And the cult leader says, as he's talking about the sermons that they got from Alton speaking in tongue, these are the words of the Lord. And then Paul comes back with, or the federal government, which I liked the writing there. And then it ends with the cult leader kind of leaning in and saying to Paul, you all have no idea what you are dealing with, do you? And it's like the dun, dun, dun. And it was a great way to end that hook because there's a lot more going on and the government doesn't know what they're doing. And even the cult doesn't fully understand what's going on with Alton's powers. So yeah, great mystery box. The thing that I didn't love about the hook, there was really only one thing I didn't like. And that was the scene where they are driving at night. They're trying to keep a low profile. They're driving with their headlights off. So Lucas drives with night vision goggles, which I thought that was a cool scene. So we got to like see it from his perspective. But then they decide to turn the lights back on after they've gotten some distance away from the cops. And as soon as they turn the headlights back on, there is a random car in the middle of the road that they hit. And this is used as a plot device to then get the cop altercation happening, where we see that there's a very different opinion from Roy and Lucas how to handle that cop, and shots are fired, and there's some tension there. And I think that part worked, but getting us there with the car with a lady asleep at the wheel at the middle of the night in the middle of the road, I thought that was too plotty, and you could have done it another way. How I would have written that is I would have just had them, driving with their headlights off and speeding, and then a cop notices, and so the cop pulls them over, and then you still have the tense moment because the cop is like, he knows that there is a Amber Alert out for this kid, right? So he recognizes it, and you could have still had that same tense moment without having to have the weird car in the middle of the road and that lady. So that's my only complaint about the hook. But other than that, good hook, and wanted to see what's going to happen next in this movie.
Obviously, I know the scene you're talking about because it's what led to the shooting I had mentioned. I would just say the reason I thought that worked had less to do with your criticism, which I agree with. It is kind of plotty. It's that it's used well to show how these different characters react to things and what their personalities are. Not only is, Lucas the guy who has to shoot the cop and is reluctant about it, but he runs over to see if he can help the person in the vehicle that was hit and things like that, where Roy is more like, no, Alton's the focus, we just need to keep going. And Roy is clearly have no problem just killing the police officer. For those reasons, I thought it was fine.
So the first thing I would like to point out about the plot is the world building that they did around this cult and just the whole subplot of the cult itself. As a writer, I had some issues with this. There's already the FBI/NSA government after Alton. My big question is, do we really need the cult goons to go after him as well? Like, it's enough going on in this film with Alton's mystery powers, the March 6th thing, where are they trying to go, the government after them. Like, you didn't need the cult after them too. It just added a layer that was unnecessary to the story. And what's even more confusing to me is the cult itself, and the backstory around this cult is really fuzzy and confusing. So, as I had mentioned, they set it up to have Christian-esque origins, right? The women wear dresses very similar to the Warren Jeffs polygamous sect, FLDS, right? And they talk about these are the words of the Lord, speaking in tongues, whatnot. But the cult is centered around Alton and his sermons that come from when he's speaking in tongues, which is really just encrypted government satellite stuff, right? And what I don't understand is if the cult is centered around Alton, what was the cult centered around before Alton? Like, it's really unclear. Like, did the cult start off as like a polygamous offshoot, and then when they realized Alton had special powers and he just so happened to be born in the cult, then they repurposed their cult to be around Alton? Like, that was really unclear to me. And at some point in the cult's history, Alton was born to Roy and Sarah, who were both a part of the cult pre-Alton and his special powers. And so that's just random, I guess, that the cult got this special alien kid born into it. And then Sarah leaves the cult, the Alton's mom, for reasons never explained. She leaves like a couple years prior and then Roy is raising Alton on the cult just on his own on this ranch. And then Roy allows Alton to be adopted by the cult leader. That's also never explained. There's just a lot of stuff with this cult that's very confusing and I don't think adds to the story.
There are a lot of things that are just never well explained. A lot of loose ends are not tied up. That is an okay way to start a film, particularly one that begins in the middle of the action and has a mystery box structure. But by the end of the film, or the end of the story, you need to have those loose ends tied up. I think the central problem with the cult, though, since that's where we're focusing right now, is that it wasn't necessary. This could easily have been a government agency tracking this kid because they found out that he's hacking, or is not hacking, but able to listen to their communications. Or pick the cult and just have it the cult following after them. Having both of those pursuing forces, I don't think added anything to the movie. Having the cult detracted in part because it was unnecessary, but also because that storyline ultimately I don't think it goes anywhere.
Yeah, it's killed off at like 2/3 of the way through the film. Even the writers decide, I don't really know what to do with these cult goons. We're going to have them kidnap Alton, and then the government's going to immediately like intervene and then take over and then kidnap Alton from the cult goons. And then at that point, the cult goons are just completely disappeared from the story. So I could tell the writers didn't know how to wrap up that plot when they did that, because it was just like they kidnap Alton and then immediately the government kidnaps Alton from the cult goons. So yeah, I feel like the reason they maybe wanted to do the plot was so that they could figure out a way to get Alton to grow up on the fringes of society, and that's why it's taken the government 8 years or whatnot to track him down. They set up his special powers that he has to wear glasses sometimes, or like these goggles and earphones, because he's just hypersensitive to the world around him. He has laser eyes that he can beam at people and have them see things, and the speaking in tongue stuff. So I understand that's why they dropped the cult in there, but you could have gotten to the same thing by just having him grow up in a more rural setting away from the urban society, so that because they could keep him a secret that way as well. And yeah, the March 6th became the cult's day of judgment, but you could have easily just had the kids say, this is the day of judgment, or this is my transformative day. Like, you didn't need the cult in there. So yeah, just overall led to confusion, and there wasn't enough value add. Like, it didn't deliver anything substantial to the film.
That plot line doesn't lead anywhere. If that had led to something at the end, so maybe the cult goons, maybe they're there at the end and there's some revelatory moment for them, something like that. Maybe you could have justified it by saying, this is where faith takes you, right? Some sort of commentary on that, if that was the point.
Or the cult gets transformed into this new planet or dimension. Like, they get to go because they've been loyal to Alton. Even if you did something like that, it could work.
You could lean into that more, and that maybe the cult is something that's used by the Altonoids, as I'm calling the extra-dimensional aliens, or humans, or whatever they are. Maybe they use the cult as breeders, because it's never really explained why Alton has his abilities, in the sense of, is this how all these people who live in a parallel world, did they all come from humans? Was he some sort of weird mutant? Is Roy really his dad, or did his mom get knocked up by some luminous being from the dimension? I mean, there's a lot of stuff there that isn't really answered, but are reasonable questions for your viewer to ask, which does lead into one of my issues with it, which is the whole mystery box. And if you're going to have a mystery box, there should be an answer, and it should be satisfying. The TV series Lost is a perfect example of a mystery box that most people found was not satisfying, right? There were a lot of questions at the end about all these plot lines and plot points that were dropped in and never expanded on, and then the ending was terrible. when you're constructing a mystery box, it's not enough just to say, well, here are a bunch of half-explained little details that you as a viewer can wonder about. At the end, there has to be some reason for them. You should have something satisfying. And this goes back to the big issue with the cult, is that there is no satisfying answer to any of the questions that the cult raises.
100% agree. Lost sucked. Like, the amount of time and energy I committed to that show for the not ending that it gave was extremely frustrating. And as this is what happens when a writer is good at hooking you in with mysteries, but they don't have a sense of where their own story is going to resolve the mystery. And that's just poor writing. Like, you as a writer are responsible for your story. And it's like, if you're going to put in a little tantalizing bit, you need to like use the bit later on. It's Chekhov's gun. If you're going to hang a gun on the wall in the beginning of the story, it needs to fire at some point later on in the story. Like, if you're like, you need to actually use your elements that you're dropping in. And this cult was not used in a good way.
That actually leads to a question I had about something you'd mentioned before. You'd gone through some of the superpowers that Alton has. One of the problems with this movie is that Alton's power set, what he can do, seems to change based on the needs of the plot at the moment. He goes from being basically able to perform some telekinesis and telepathy to being some sort of weird technopath, I guess. Like, he can communicate with machinery. His powers go from, in one scene he is dragging a spy satellite out of orbit. In the next, the two cult goons put a bag over his head and he can't do anything to them. There's a scene where he's like feeling sick and he gets out of the car that they're in there on the side of the road, and he like kneels down or falls to the ground, whatever, and like all the grass around him dies. They don't really gel. It's like the writer was basically, well, I want him to do something neat in this scene. We've already seen him do these things, so let's just throw something new at it. If you set up a character or a type of character in a story, say like vampires. So you take vampires and you say they burst into flames in the sunlight. But then you decide, well, I want this character who's a vampire to have a moment in the sun. You can do that. The TV series Angel actually did something like that, where this evil law firm developed something called necro-tempered glass, which then basically filtered out the purifying rays of the sun, so Angel, the titular vampire hero of the story, could stand there and look outside during the day. It's explained. It's like, we have set up these rules, now we're breaking the rules, but here's why we are breaking them, and here's how we're breaking them. It's still consistent. This film seemed to establish rules and then immediately break them, and there didn't seem to be a lot of consistency. I never understood what the scope of Alton's powers really were.
I was so confused about the internal consistency with his powers and what he could or couldn't do. So you got the gas station scene where he brings down the satellite. He messes with electronics. We see that on like unlocking the Prius and tapping into radio frequencies. He has some kind of ESP where he can sense things happening before they happen. Like, he knows helicopters are coming before anyone else can see them. He has the blue laser eyes where he shows people things, but we never understand exactly what he shows people when he locks into them with his blue laser eyes. He can speak in tongues, but his tongues are just interpreting government satellite stuff. Unclear why it's just that. And then, speaking of the sun, since you brought that up with the vampires, there's a whole moment about that. So Alton is impacted negatively by the sun, and so that's why they drive at night, and he's better at night, and he has to be like protected from the sun during the day. And there's this moment where he and his dad are on the run, and they've hid in this underground cave, and then it's morning, and he's like, we need to go out in the sun, and the dad's like, you can't do that. So we know that that's a restriction that he has because of his powers. But Alton's like, no, I can. It's time. And so then he goes out, and in the sunrise is where we see the other world that he comes from. Like he calls it a world built on top of our world. All of a sudden, he understands who he is. He's an alien from this other world. And then he's okay. He's cured, and now he can be in the sun. When we don't understand why that is. So yeah, his powers keep changing. We don't understand the full extent of them, and it's frustrating because you don't really know what his limits are. To help you in the story have those moments of suspense where you're like, oh no, Alton's not allowed to be in the sun, but somehow they have to go out in the sun to survive. Like you don't know that because the rules seem to keep changing. And I think it's just the writers, just like with the cult, the writers didn't know where to go with it. They also didn't know where to go with Alton's powers fully.
I think it's clear they didn't. And that's a problem when you're creating your world. It comes clear to the viewer then that first, they can't rely on the information they're being given about the strengths and weaknesses of the character. So to your point, then you don't know when, as a viewer, you should actually feel any sort of threat or danger or tension for this character. If in one scene he is scrubbing satellites from the sky and then the next he stubs his toe and can't take care of himself, it is very difficult at that point to understand as that viewer what your emotions are supposed to be at that moment. And that is the job as a storyteller, is to, in part, guide the emotions of the person who is consuming your work of fiction. You want to set a tone, you want to and understand how not just the characters are feeling, but how they're supposed to feel towards the characters. And one way to do that is create a coherent world, or in this case, coherent powers for your character so they know when he is actually vulnerable and not, so they can become invested in those moments and become fearful or joyous or whatever. When you don't do that, and when it's something that is core to the character, so it's not some ancillary thing. His powers are the reason everyone's after him. His powers are his key to eventually getting to his true home. His powers are key to him surviving over the course of the chase, right? If you don't have them firmly established and set firm rules for them, then at that point, it becomes less an exercise of you becoming invested in that character and more just wanting to see how the different set pieces go. What kind of special effects are there going to be? What kind of chases are going to be? Are you going to see more, neat moments like the satellite debris falling from the sky and stuff like that? And this film has a lot of neat moments like that, but there is an emotional core that I found missing, in part because it's not really established when this kid is in danger or not.
Yeah, the best job they did in this film with establishing an emotional core that I cared about was the relationship that father and son had. And to an extent, the mom, like they were willing to go to pretty extreme lengths to try to help their kid get to where he needed to be in the marshlands of the Florida Panhandle on March 6th. And they knew that it might mean that they would lose their child, right? Like this is the one thing they've invested in their lives, and they knew that that might mean he was going to leave them after March 6th, but they knew it was the right thing to do for him. And so that sense of doing the right thing for your kid, even though that's going to hurt you, like that was the emotional undertones, and they did a decent job with that, but it would have been better you would have been invested more if you understood Alton's powers fully.
It's interesting you chose that as the emotional core. You are supposed to find the connection between Roy and Alton to be obviously one of the cores. As far as the characters, I actually thought that the relationship between Roy and Lucas was more interesting because it was more complex. There was more challenges in it, especially since Lucas was someone who was brought in not because he is a parent of the child, but he's a friend of Roy. And he feels, and obviously we also are told that he was shown something by Alton, which we never know what it is. I actually found their relationship to be the more interesting one in the film, or the most interesting one in the film, especially when compared to either Roy and Alton or Roy and Sarah. This film is helped in those relationships by the cast, of course. even let's set aside some of the issues with world building and stuff. The cast interacts in an interesting way, and they're good actors. So I think that does help. However, if the foundation of your story, whether it is your world building or the resolution of your mystery box, isn't satisfying, all the good acting in the world is not going to help, because the viewer is going to be like, well, what was the real point of all this?
Yeah. Yeah. So this felt, I mean, that kind of boils, like in a nutshell, that captures the essence of the issues I think we both have with this film. Very strong acting, cool special effects, some interesting ideas that are never tied together into a cohesive story that's satisfying at the end. And this is where it goes back to good writing, and there were some missing components. But the writer did not get out a giant whiteboard or chalkboard and like go through and plot out all their story to ensure everything tied together. They just didn't do that. And there was the gaps, and you could feel those gaps as you were watching this film.
I wonder how much of this is something that most writers have to guard against, which is you become so familiar with your character and your world that you lose sight of the fact that you have to make other people who have not created it and do not have it living in their headspace, you have to make it accessible and interesting and understandable to them. I do find that sometimes with my writing, is that why it's always helpful to have, beta readers and stuff, right? Is that you made this world, whether it is a 1-page short story or a 1,000-page novel. It's your world, so it makes sense to you. I find that you have to be on guard, though. How do you explain all that to the reader? How do you immerse them in the world that came out of your head? You have to be careful about that. And I wonder if that's one of the issues we're seeing with this. Did Nichols have this all worked out in his head? And I'm certain a lot of it he did, but just didn't feel like he needed to explain to people that they would either just get it or not care.
Yeah. And also, it's just good use of time on screen, unlike a book where you can spend longer getting into your story and explaining it and having your characters naturally grow and get depth as the story moves on. You have limited time on screen to do the same thing. So you have to be really tight with your world building and your character development. And I think what happened with this film is they spent too much time on this cult subplot that didn't matter. And because of that, they didn't have enough screen time to go into Alton's powers better, to further build out the relationship between Alton and the mother. Because we get it with Alton and the father, but there's a lot left not understood about Alton and the mother and why the mother gave him up for a few years, I mean, it's well acted by Kirsten Dunst, but still a lot unsaid. And so, yeah, they just wasted screen time on this stupid cult plot that could have been used to better explain what was in the writer-director's head about Alton's powers and how he ended up in our world. None of that was ever brought up because they didn't have time.
Exactly. And a lot of this, as you said, just would have been fixed by cutting out that entire thing with the ranch. Yeah, it took valuable screen time from the more interesting, important parts of the story. The only issue I would have with Sarah as a character, not as Dunst's acting, which is fine, I think she should have been in the movie from the beginning. Because she's introduced a little bit later, and by that time, we've already spent a lot of time with spinning wheels of the cult. We spend a bunch of time with the feds. We spend a lot of time with Roy and Lucas, and that is part of the reason why I think their relationship is stronger, just because there's more screen time given to it. I didn't time it, but it seemed like it was probably about halfway through the movie, so you're already well into the second act. You have a new character pop in. You've already started getting invested in the people who are there from the beginning. And now you have someone new come in who's supposed to be a new main character. And I think that they had just had the three of them and Alton as a unit trying to get to someplace. You could have kind of equalized that screen time between them and done a better job of developing those relationships. But that's not the core part of this problem with this movie. It really, I think, just goes back to the stuff we've talked about. The world building and the entire mystery box structure are problems. And they, to me, don't pay off in the end. Which, unless you have anything else about the plot you'd like to talk about, could get us to the ending.
Yeah, let's move on to the endings. So Jeff, what are your thoughts?
The ending is a mixed bag. It is well paced. We get some really visually impressive effects of this extra dimensional city. There is a nice sense of wonder that is generated. The problem, though, is that so little is explained about what is happening and what was the meaning of it all, and who are these aliens and or evolved humans or whatever they are. And there are little detail things like this alien city pop up over apparently a big chunk of the southeast United States. It's like, well, what happened to the people who are standing where there's now a gigantic building? Are they all dead? Is it out of phase? Are they walking around? And this gets into what I consider actually a significant plot hole, which could easily have been answered was, why is Alton? In the sense of, why did this super being, why does he exist as a human? And then all this light show and giant alien cities and stuff all appear over a huge chunk of the US. Does this happen all the time? Because the city is full of, we see that the buildings that were shown are full of these luminous beings. Why do we not have like alien cities popping up all the time briefly as some kid transits into it? So then it's like, well, was Alton special? And if he was special, how? Why? Firestarter has an explanation for why the Drew Barrymore character has superpowers. Her parents were subjected to a government experiment, and then when they had a daughter, she inherited some of these abilities. Now, it's all pseudoscience nonsense, but it's an explanation. It says, well, here's why this person can do these things. This movie, for all it's setting up that there's this grand moment on March 6th that, everyone is aiming towards, and it's going to be this huge revelatory moment, I was unclear as to why he actually had powers at all. And who were these people he was going to? It's kind of implied they're evolved humans. Because I think he at one point says there's a world over ours or something and it's full of people. Then it's like, well, how do they all get there? And how did you start from these two schlubs? I think you do have to put some work into explaining, even if it is purely in terms that only make sense within the context of your story, you have to put some work into explaining it. It seemed like the writer was like, I want to have a big spectacular scene, and I'm just not going to care about explaining and wrapping up these threads, these story threads. And I found that element very unsatisfying. There were so many plot points that I don't think were explained or even cursory addressed that didn't work, and that was disappointing.
I would agree in the sense that it didn't explain how Alton got here, and is this something that just was a rare accident where he was born into the wrong universe, and so now he's coming back, and this has never happened before, or if this is something that happens periodically. It didn't. I took that this was a rare accident and he was the only one that accidentally got born here. But you could have easily written that in where Alton, in his revelation moment where he sees the world built on top of ours and the sunrise, say, I realized that there was a mistake and I was accidentally born on Earth and I should have been born on my planet. And you guys, Sarah and Roy, were just the vessels, right? So, I mean, you could have just done something very simple like that to explain it that was satisfying, and then we can move on from it. So, yeah, they didn't really tie it up. The things that I thought worked about this ending is that while predictable, it worked in how they set up Paul's character. Paul ends up helping Alton escape, and that worked for his character with how they set him up. So I was fine with that. The action scene with the car and the military blockades, they did a good job with that. It was good action, the car flipping over, the tense moments where they had to go through the blockade, Alton telling them, where to turn to get to the marshlands of the Florida Panhandle. All of that worked well for me. There was a nice moment between the dad and Alton at the end before he let Alton go, and Alton and the mom were the ones that actually made it to this particular rendezvous point in the marshes, where Alton's like, "You don't have to worry about me anymore, Dad." And the dad says, "I'll always worry about you, Alton. That's the deal. Like, you're my son. That's the deal." And I liked that. I thought that was it was well acted between the two characters. And it just got at that father-son bonding that no matter what, I'm always going to worry about you. That's the deal. I'm your dad. And so it was a good moment. And then I loved the special effects. While didn't really get explained how these buildings popped up over our buildings. It was an overlaying of worlds and dimensions. It was so cool. Like the way they did it was an awesome special effect where you're just transformed into this other world. That's what I didn't like about the ending, is that I don't felt they ended it at the right point. So ending it where Alton disappears and joins his world and the people are all in awe looking up at what happened, that would have been a fine place to end it. But how they chose to end this film is they had to tack on this government interrogating Lucas, and Roy's in some type of jail being experimented on, and Sarah's in hiding and she finally cuts off her cult braid. And I was just just end on your high note. What are your thoughts about how they chose to end it, like the final scene?
I agree. It added nothing to the ending. The appropriate point to end this film is with Alton transiting to the new world, to his world.
Yeah, I think we can both, to tie a bow on this, agree they ended on a low note, unnecessary, versus the high note of Alton transforming into his new world.
So, what scene did you like best?
So, I chose the special effects scene that I just spoke about, but I thought it was really cool to see Alton's world emerging into our world. What about you, Jeff?
So near the end of the movie, there's a scene where the cult goons show up, they get Alton, there's kind of a chase, and then our heroes get to a roadblock and see that the cult guys are presumably dead, because you see the vehicle area end with blood on it, and Alton's being flown off in a helicopter. That was a really well done sequence because you had some nice action. Soundtrack was really good. There was this throbbing background sound they had that I thought was really effective. But it also gave that interesting view of the bigger picture, is that all the stuff with the military being there and blocking the traffic and the helicopters and clearly these cult guys is being taken out. It showed the bigger stuff that was going on without actually doing expository stuff showing it being set up. So you see it all from the point of view of our heroes, that there are bigger forces at war. But I thought that was a really nicely paced and fairly tense sequence, and a good way to show the big picture without having a lot of people talking about what they're doing. So that was my favorite scene. So what did you like the least?
So there's a scene partway through the movie where Paul Sevier is trying to figure out where Alton is going. He's trying to interpret all of the code and clues from Alton's various sermons, and he's got it on his big board, and he's staring at it, and then he has that aha moment where he figures it out and says I know where Alton's going. And he doesn't really explain how he figures it out. He starts talking about it, but that you never understand how he figures it out. He's going with all these, he starts saying, well, these are coordinates and numbers from the sermons, and he talks like he completely understands it and he's going to tell the audience why, but then he doesn't tell the audience why. And I watched this scene several times just to make sure I wasn't missing something. And even after multiple times watching that scene, I couldn't figure out from what he was looking at and what he was saying, what the tie-in was, like how he put these pieces together and what the clues were for him to know where they were headed in the Florida Panhandle. What about you, Jeff?
Same scene. And for basically the same reasons. I kept waiting for there to be a moment when the Sevier would explain how he figured out where they were going. That was such a key plot point, because this is how the feds figure out how, where to go to intercept Alton. Without him magically figuring out where they're heading, the feds are basically lost. So to not have some explanation, it could easily have been when Alton is in the government facility and he says, I just want to talk to Paul. He could easily have said, I put that in your head, right? We already know he's a telepath or something like that, right? It doesn't have to be some long, in-depth thing. Why not do that? As you said, it goes back to a core problem, I think, with this movie, is that there are a lot of moments that the writing is just extremely weak.
I like that we both chose the same scene. It's rare that we pick the same scene. So,
what was your final rating?
So I gave this movie a 3 out of 5. I think it's worth watching because the acting's very strong and the special effects are cool. And I love the soundtrack. You had mentioned that earlier. It has a really neat soundtrack that helps keep that momentum going in the film. And so if you like sci-fi, good special effects, good acting, worth watching for that, but definitely loses some points on the lazy writing with tying this plot together. So know that going into it, that you're going to be frustrated at moments because you're not going to get the mystery box fully answered. What about you, Jeff?
I, too, gave it 3 luminous ascended pandas. And pretty much for the same reasons. It's a slightly above average science fiction film. It has, as you said, good acting. It's well shot, good effects, good soundtrack. It just loses points because of the script problems or the story problems we've been talking about. But still, well worth checking out. Well, we will see you next episode. Stream on, people.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us for Stream On. Tune in next week. We'll be reviewing Ghost World, currently on Amazon. Stream On is a production of Steph and Jeff Writes Media. Reproduction of this podcast without written consent is prohibited. All rights reserved. 2020.